political experts, senior journalists from print, radio and television. Malcolm Farr from the Daily Telegraph. From Radio 3AW in Melbourne, Neil Mitchell. Michelle Grattan from The Age, the ABC's chief political correspondent, Jim Middleton. And our moderator tonight is the Nine Network's political editor, Laurie Oakes.
Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us, especially Mr. Howard and Mr. Latham. We're pleased to again be the national broadcaster, bringing you this important election debate live. The ground rules for the debate have been set by the two leaders, equal time and a fair go to get their point across. This is a debate facilitated by questions from the panel. Good luck, gentlemen. We've tossed, and Mr. Howard will kick off the debate with a 2-minute opening address to be followed by Mr. Latham. Mr. Howard, your opening address.
Good evening. Last Monday, I was very pleased to announce an additional $1.8 billion for Medicare. This announcement will make GP services for all Australians more affordable, and coupled with our new safety net, it represents a strong ongoing commitment by the government to Medicare. Now, this announcement last Monday was made possible by the fact that our economic position, our budget position, is even stronger now than what it was at the time of the budget last May. And I mention this to make a very important point, and that is that running a strong economy is not an end in its own right. It's only useful if it produces outcomes for people. It's only useful if it produces a human dividend. And in this case, the human dividend was more money for Medicare, which is so important for the health of all Australians. And it does remind all of us that we can make all the promises in the world, we can offer all sorts of things for the future, but unless we run a strong economy, unless we have a capacity to run a strong economy, all the promises in the world are not going to be realised. This debate, this election is about Australia's future, and critical to Australia's future is the maintenance of a strong, growing economy. The other issue, of course, which is very critical to Australia's future is that of national security and defence. Terrorism is an insidious threat to our way of life, and we can never negotiate or compromise with terrorists. We must always maintain, for the sake of our future, a strong line against all the threats that terrorism carries.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Mr. Latham, your opening address.
Well, thanks, Laurie. Could I just start by paying my respects to the people who've suffered so much as a result of the tragic bombing in Jakarta. It's a reminder of the uncertain world in which we live. But I think that we also need to be positive. We need to be talking about solutions, and I hope here tonight that Mr. Howard and I can show people the very best of our Australian democracy. After all, that's why I'm running to be Prime Minister, to make Australia a stronger, fairer and safer place. How can we make our country safer? Well, we need to do so much more in our part of the world to fight the scourge of terrorism. We need to identify and eliminate these terrorists. We need to break up and destroy JI in particular. And this has been the problem with the commitment in Iraq. As so many experts have pointed out, it's made Australia a larger target. It's made us less safe in the war against terror. Police Commissioner Mick Kelty's made that point, and earlier today, even Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson made that point. So we can't afford mistakes like that in the future. We've got to get it right in our part of the world. Laurie, to make Australia a stronger and fairer place, I want to take the financial pressure off Australian families. I want to ease the squeeze on middle Australia. You know, on budget night, Mr. Howard said it wasn't possible to provide tax relief under $52,000 a year. Well, now Labor's showing how it can be done. And we've also got a plan to improve the family payment system, delivering benefits of $70 to $80 a week to typical middle-income families around the country. And when we're easing the squeeze, we've also got to do it in health and education, getting the national rate of bulk billing back up to 80%, and also ensuring we don't have a user-pays education system. We need fair funding of our schools, 40,000 extra TAFE and university places, and Labor will stop the regressive 25% increase in HECS. So we can do these things, we can make our nation stronger and fairer, And we can do it through new energy, new ideas, new programs for the future. And that's why I'm asking for the support of the Australian people in this election campaign.
Thanks, Mr. Latham. Mr. Howard, if I could ask the first question of you. The Jakarta embassy bombing is a tragedy, but it will affect the election campaign climate, and we can't ignore it. It makes the question of terrorism and how we deal with it a central issue. US Defence Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said on Friday they, the terrorists, are going to be going after the coalition countries. Your Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson conceded this morning it might be the case that we're more of a target because we're part of the coalition of the willing. Will you now admit that our involvement in Iraq has raised Australia's profile as a terrorist target?
Laurie, this country was a terrorist target long before we entered the campaign in Iraq. Bin Laden criticised us for our liberation of East Timor. There was the abortive attempt to blow up the Australian High Commission in Singapore in December 2001. 88 of our fellow Australians died in Bali in October 2002, which was before we went into Iraq. So the idea that we suddenly became a terrorist target because of Iraq is false. But leave that aside. Think what you may about whether or not we should have gone into Iraq. The day this country allows terrorists to determine things like that is the day we lose control over our future, because those are things that have to be determined according to the assessment at the time. I believe that our decision to go into Iraq was right. I believe that our capacity to deal with terrorism on our doorstep has not been impaired in any way by the units that we have deployed to Iraq. The frontline assets that have to be used against terrorism are the assets of intelligence and cooperation. I mean, as we speak, we have 51 Australian Federal Police officers on the ground in Jakarta, and they are there as a result of a decision we took months ago to establish a rapid deployment capacity within the Australian Federal Police to deal precisely with that sort of contingency. We can fulfil our obligation in Iraq. We should not cut and run from Iraq. We should stay and finish the job. That is the Australian way.
Mr. Latham, your response to that?
Well, Laurie, I've been listening to the experts. The head of the Australian Federal Police, Mick Kelty, has said that we're a bigger target as a result of the conflict in Iraq. The 43 eminent Australians, people who've served our nation so well, have made the same point. And just earlier today, Mr. Howard's deputy, John Anderson, was saying the exact same thing. We have become less safe in the war against terror because of the conflict in Iraq. Why? Because it diverted so many resources from the real task. And for Australia, the real task is in our part of the world, in Asia. I mean, I've no doubt that if all the time, the effort, the money, the resources that went into Iraq had been used to break up Al-Qaeda, to smash JI, to find Bin Laden, the world today would be a safer place. Australia would be safer and more secure. And while, you know, we've got no way of reversing this decision, what's happened, we've got to learn the mistakes that were made in relation to Iraq and get it right for the future. Unless we do that, we diminish our capacity to keep our people safe.
Mr. Howard, would you like to
I don't think it was a mistake to see off a butcher like Saddam Hussein, and whether Mr. Latham likes it or not, the reality is that if the advice of his party had been followed, Saddam Hussein would still be in power in Iraq. And as so far as the assets are concerned, we have a capacity to deal with terrorism on our doorstep. And one of the reasons why we are a heightened target, and the point really that John Anderson was making this morning, was that we have been successful in cooperation with the Indonesians in weakening JI, and that, in the view of one of our intelligence agencies, is a possible reason why the attack took place outside the Australian Embassy in Jakarta, because we have been successful in the wake of the murder of 88 Australians in Bali in working to weaken JI in cooperation with the Indonesians.
Mr. Latham, I'll quote Donald Rumsfeld at you as well. He said on Friday, some countries have elections taking place and there's a big tug of war over whether or not they should stay in Iraq or whether they should have been there. And the terrorists know that. They're not stupid. And they think, goodness, if we can affect that. Do you agree that the terrorists who bombed our embassy may have been trying to influence the Australian election? Do you think your promise to pull troops out of Iraq may encourage terrorists to try to influence the election? Do you stick by your troops out by Christmas pledge, even if that's the case? Stick by it no matter what?
Well, Laurie, there's no way in the world terrorists would ever affect the policies and stance of the Australian Labor Party. We've made it clear that we wouldn't negotiate with them. We set our policies in Australia's national interest. And we've been saying for a number of years now that Australia's permanent interests in the war against terror are in Southeast Asia. And let me just give an example of what we should have been doing. One of the great problems with JI is their movement in and out of terrorist bases in the southern Philippines. And Indonesia, Singapore and Malaysia have been trying to muster air surveillance and maritime security to try and stop this flow of the terrorists in and out of the Philippines. Australia has only been marginal to that effort. We've got a few surveillance operations, but no great maritime presence. This is where Labor would dedicate our resources, to our region, to our part of the world, to the real security of the Australian people. We should be part of that gateway operation with our neighbours, Indonesia, Singapore and Malaysia, to break up and destroy JI, to disrupt their activities as much as possible. That's the Labor approach. We don't believe our permanent interests lie on the other side of the world. They lie on our side of the world, and we'll always dedicate ourselves to that purpose. Labor has a strategy to deal with national security. It's in our part of the world, and also to do more on the home front. A Department of Homeland Security, a Coast Guard, improved regional airport security. We've got to get it right where the Australian people live, where our nation is located in the region. And that's why, one of the reasons why we didn't support the Iraq conflict in the first place. We've made a strategic decision which we believe is in Australia's national interest. That'll never be influenced by these evil, barbaric terrorists, never. We'll always do the things that are right for Australia, defending and securing this country as best we can.
Mr Howard, your response?
Well, Laurie, there's not the slightest doubt that if Australia were to cut and run from Iraq, that would give enormous heart to those who are opposed to the coalition, including terrorists, because it would send a signal to the rest of the world that one of the countries that was part of the original coalition has weakened and buckled. And I think that would be sending completely the wrong signal. And however Mr Latham tries to rationalise it, he cannot escape the heavy burden of that reality. I have heard people who've disagreed with my original decision. I've heard people come to me and say, look, John, you were wrong to go there in the first place, but having gone there, you've got to finish the job. And this idea that you could cut and run without doing significant damage to the coalition cause, and whether we like it or not, terrorists are involved in Iraq, and it's part of the worldwide battle against terrorism, and we can do both. We can finish the job there and do our full part in our part of the world.
Mr Latham?
Well, Laurie, I think for all the political differences I have with Mr Howard, I'll say this, that I believe as a person he despises and detests these terrorists as much as I do. But I think on two counts he's got it wrong. The strategy's been wrong. We should have been securing our nation in our part of the world. Our permanent interests in national security lie here. And Mr Howard talks about cut and run. The other thing we've got to recognise is that the war against terror, it'll take at least 3 years to win it. And I'm giving a commitment for the long haul to serve the full term as Prime Minister and make sure I do everything I humanly can to secure the safety of the Australian people. Mr Howard in this election campaign has yet to say he's going to serve the 3 years. I mean, this is life or death for our nation. And I think the Prime Minister, if he was fair dinkum, he'd make the commitment that he'd serve the 3 years. He wouldn't be sort of dancing around it. He talks about cut and run. It's possible that after the election, he'll be leaving office and leaving it to someone else. That's not the commitment we need at this time for the future of our nation.
Michelle, you have a question for the Prime Minister?
Sorry,
Mr Latham, I beg your pardon.
Question for Mr Latham. Mr Latham, if you become Prime Minister, what will you be saying in your first conversation with the American President about how Australia's attitudes will change? How will you promote a stronger and more independent Australian voice, which you said is needed, within the alliance?
Well, I'll be making plain Labor's long-standing commitment to the American alliance. This is something that was established by a great Labor wartime Prime Minister, John Curtin. We've always supported the American alliance. I'll be making that plain, and I'll also be spelling out our commitments for national security in our part of the world. The maritime strategy I mentioned earlier on, our commitment to work with our neighbours with improved policing, tracking down and eliminating these terrorists. I'll also be talking to him about our commitment to the rebuilding of Iraq. President Bush, or if it's President Kerry, They'd know our point of difference, that we didn't support this conflict in the first place, but we have a commitment to the rebuilding of Iraq through the processes of the United Nations. We'd be committing resources to healthcare services, customs services, working hand in glove with our colleagues from the United States, and also providing some non-combatant personnel for the UN Protective Force. So I think that is the right approach, it's the right strategy, it's consistent with the American alliance, and I'll let our partners and allies know that we're rock solid in wanting to win the war against terror and giving them my best advice and counsel on how that can be achieved for the mutual benefit and security of our two great nations.
Mr. Howard, your response?
Well, I don't think any of that would wash away the psychological and real blow to the alliance of Australia, having been in there at the beginning with the United States, cutting and running. And the odd situation, Laurie, is that Mr. Latham's opposite number in the United States, Senator Kerry, actually supports President Bush in finishing the job. His opposite number in the United Kingdom, the Conservative Party leader Michael Howard, also supports Britain staying in Iraq to finish the job. And in that sense, the Australian Labor Party is the odd man out. I mean, the reality is that we, having been there at the beginning, think what you may about that original decision, having gone there to pull out before the job has been finished, I think is a huge mistake and would be an enormous psychological and real blow, because our people are doing very valuable work, both military and humanitarian.
Well, Laurie, Mr. Howard talks about finishing the job. For goodness sake, we've got to start the real security job in our part of the world. We should be part of that maritime security effort, disrupting and breaking up JI. We should be committing more resources working with Southeast Asian nations to beat these evil people and make our nation as safe as possible. Now, we've got a commitment to the rebuilding of Iraq, but we've also got a very strong and clear commitment to Australia's national interests. I support the American alliance, but if there's a difference of opinion between us and the United States, I'll always back the Australian side of the argument. I'll always back Australia's interests as best I can. And because the relationship is strong, because Labor's always supported the American alliance, you can have these points of difference, and it's legitimate. I think it's necessary for the Australian Prime Minister to step forward proudly and say, look, we've got to put Australia's interests first, particularly when we're talking about the security of our people. This is the number one priority, the number one thing that a political and national leader must do. Secure the nation, secure the safety of our people. And you really haven't got the luxury of doing anything but backing the Australian national interest always.
Ms. Shaw-Grattan, now you have a question for the Prime Minister.
Mr. Howard, do you think the war on terrorism can be finally and definitively won? And if you do think that, what sort of time frame, 10 years say? And should Australia always be at the front line of that war, or are there times, will there be times when you think legitimately we could say no to a United States request for a commitment?
Well, I can't put a timeline on it, Michelle. I'm not as optimistic as Mr. Latham. He said 3 years a moment ago. That's the most incredibly optimistic prediction. I'd like to believe that he was right. I can't put a timeline on it. I think it will ultimately be won. I think it will be long and bloody. And we're dealing with a group of people who are outside the bounds of normal human behaviour. Nobody could have been other than profoundly moved by those terrible pictures coming out of Beslan in Russia. People who will shoot children in the back, people who will behave in that kind of manner towards children are, of course, outside the bounds of human behaviour. And they're not the sort of people that you can ever negotiate with. So the idea that we can somehow reach some kind of compromise is completely unrealistic. We will continue as we have already very effectively done, and that is to cooperate very closely with our friends in the region. After all, we did jointly chair a counter-terrorism ministerial meeting. We've invested $36 million in a counter-terrorism establishment in Indonesia. We've signed 9 memoranda of understanding on counter-terrorism. We have very extensive cooperation, and as I said earlier, the relationship between the Australian Federal Police and our intelligence agencies and their counterparts in the region is the critical element in our campaign. That is far more important. As for whether we would ever step back, that would depend entirely on the circumstances of each individual challenge, always assessing Australia's interests first.
Your response, Mr. Latham?
Well, just to point out to the Prime Minister earlier on, I said at least 3 years to win the war against terror, and Michelle mentions 10 years. It could take that long. But for me, it makes the point about the 3, 5, 10-year commitment to actually win the fight, to see it through. And Mr. Howard has gone into this election campaign saying it's about trust. He won't bring the Australian people into his trust and say, is he going to be there for the 3 years of the Parliament if he wins this next election? So I think that long-term commitment to Australia's security is essential. There's no point cutting and running into retirement. You've got to fight the fight, and you've got to see it through. And Labor's got the strategy. We've been arguing that for a number of years, that we can do so much more on the home front. We can do so much more in our part of the world. We can do so much better with wise counsel to our allies to win the war against terror. Do whatever it takes for as long as it takes to secure our nation. And I think that is the best approach we can muster for the benefit of the Australian people.
Mr. Howard?
Well, I can only repeat that we have been doing all of these things. This absurd proposition, to use the vernacular, you can't walk and chew gum at the same time, applies. Our capacity to deal with terrorism in our region has in no way been impaired by what we have done in Iraq, or indeed has it been impaired by what we did in Afghanistan. And can I remind all of you that Afghanistan will be having free elections on the same day as we are, on the 9th of October. And women will be having the vote at that election, I think, for the first time for many, many years, if at all. And it is a reminder that despite all the negative comment, you can make real progress in the war against terrorism.
Neil Mitchell, your first question to Mr. Howard.
Mr. Howard, you mentioned Medicare in your opening comments. You didn't mention hospitals, but this is one of the areas that really worry the average person. Waiting lists are surely unacceptable in public hospitals. Waiting times in emergency departments, 48 hours and more, is common. We seem to have reformed everything else, the labour markets, the currency markets, but you continue to say that hospitals are a state issue. Do you accept that over the 8 years you've been in power, you have failed to fix the hospital system? That's one of your failures. And further, your Health Minister, Tony Abbott, has flirted with the idea of taking control of hospitals under the federal government, ending what is a ridiculous level of duplication. Will you do that? And if not, how will you fix the hospital system?
Well, Neil, I don't regard hospitals as just a state issue. I regard hospitals' administration as being the responsibility of the states. I accept, and my government accepts, full responsibility for making a huge funding contribution. And in fact, in most cases, we put more money into state hospitals than do the individual states themselves. And in the current hospital agreement, there's a 17% real increase over the lifetime of the agreement. And on top of that, there is a thing called the GST. Every last dollar of the GST, and I wonder how many people watching this program might not know, every last dollar of the GST goes to the states. And the whole idea of the GST in relation to the states was to give them an increased amount of money as the economy grew, so they would have more resources to spend on hospitals and public schools and roads and all of those things. The other thing that we are doing, we are strongly supporting the private health system. And the more money you put into private health insurance, and we are the party that is unconditionally committed to the maintenance and indeed the improvement of the incentives for private health insurance, the more you put into private health insurance, the greater the load you take off the public hospital system. So on 3 levels, we are strongly supportive of public hospitals. We make our direct funding contributions through the GST. The states will have $9 billion more over the 5-year period we're talking about to fund public hospitals and public schools. And by supporting private health insurance, we're taking the load off the hospitals, the public hospital system. Our current arrangements, and I don't have any proposals to change them, leave the administration of hospitals with the states, with the Commonwealth making the contributions that I've mentioned.
Mr. Latham?
Well, Neil, it's a really good point you've raised. As I've been getting around the country talking to doctors and public hospital managers, what they've been saying is there are 3 great pressure points on our public hospital system. The first is the $1 billion funding cut out of Canberra, the $900 million plus funding cut that's come out of Canberra from the Howard government. If we could put more money into public hospitals, obviously they'll be better off. The second pressure point has been the collapse in bulk billing. I've been to communities where they've lost 30, 40% of their bulk billing, and the pressures come on the emergency department of the public hospital. An extra 20 or 30% of people presenting just looking for the Medicare type services they can no longer get from a bulk billing doctor. And the third pressure point has been the aged care crisis. So many people who are in the hospital beds, if they could be moved on to more suitable care in the aged care system, it would take an essential pressure point off the hospitals. So those funding cuts, the collapse in bulk billing, the aged care crisis, if we lift those pressure points, we'd have a much better hospital system for the benefit of the Australian people.
Mr. Howard?
Well, this funding cut of $1 billion is a figment of the Labor Party's propaganda machine. There's been a 17% real increase. I don't know how that translates into a $1 billion funding cut. And Mr. Latham talks about collapse in bulk billing. Bulk billing has risen by 4% over the last 6 months. It's gone up to just under 71%. And as a result of the announcement I made last week, which incidentally makes GP attendance more affordable for all Australians, Mr. Latham's policies discriminate against Australians who can't find a bulk billing doctor. I mean, there are some people who choose not to go to a bulk billing doctor because they've had the same family doctor for years, and for proper health reasons they want to stay with that person. And the idea of saying to that person, well, you're not as deserving of some kind of support to make your consultations more affordable.
Neil, a question for Mr. Latham?
Well, Mr. Latham, you've just told us what's wrong with the hospitals, and you said that you will address the bulk billing issue, which is a matter of debate. But you've given us a lot of detail about your policies on Medicare, still not on hospitals, not much about hospitals. It seems to me to be a rather vague idea for a summit, which will get together a pool of money and decide how to dispose of it. It's very short on detail. Will you guarantee that under Labor, waiting lists will be reduced and waiting times will be reduced in hospitals? And if so, how do you guarantee to do it?
Well, in this campaign, we'll be outlining our hospitals policy, which is designed to bring down the waiting lists, and it's going to be a very good strategy that we're putting out in the campaign, which is all about positive solutions for the Australian people. But just come to that solution on bulk billing. Mr. Howard's saying that he's got a policy for the people who can't find a bulk billing doctor. Well, I've got a policy, it's called Medicare. And the purpose of Medicare is to ensure that we've got the availability of bulk billing around the country. And bulk billing now is 10% less than when Mr. Howard came to government in 1996. We need to get the national rate back up to 80%, investing in bulk billing, providing incentives for doctors who do the bulk billing, putting in the Medicare teams, the salaried doctors and nurses that actually provide the service direct. And there's one thing about Medicare, if you haven't got the availability of bulk billing, you haven't really got the guts of Medicare. And Labor will never give up, never surrender, never give up on getting the bulk billing rate back up to 80% where it belongs. It takes a pressure point off the public hospital system, and it is one of the foundation stones of universal health care for all Australians, that you can find a bulk billing doctor, whether it's for your children or your parents, and you can lower those out-of-pocket expenses that are putting so much pressure on Australian families. So we're going to have a good hospital strategy, but a big part of it is taking the pressure off the emergency departments by having decent bulk billing rates around the country. And we'll also be talking about resolving the aged care crisis, making a further contribution to, again, take a pressure point off our public hospitals. I mean, this is one of the big differences in the campaign. Mr. Howard, I mentioned John Anderson earlier on, he was saying that the public support a two-tier system. They don't. Because if you're in the second tier, you end up with a second-class safety net, a second-class service. Labor believes in Medicare, which is one tier, world-quality health care for all Australians. And we'll never surrender, we'll never walk away from that commitment. We set up this system, we're proud of it, and we're going to bring it back to its full health.
Mr. Howard?
Well, with great respect, that's just all rhetoric. He doesn't have a policy in relation to public hospitals, but he does have a policy to take a scalpel to the safety net, which is an integral part of Medicare now. And taking away the safety net is going to do an enormous amount of damage to hundreds of thousands of Australian families. We brought the safety net in this year, and it means that if your out-of-pocket expenses for an average family for out-of-hospital services, particularly for specialists as well as GPs, goes over $300 a year, you get 80% of the excess back. Now, Mr. Latham's answer for Medicare is to take that away. He's going to abolish the safety net. He says he cares about families. He says he's been going around the country talking to families. Well, I've been talking to families. They love the safety net. It gives them tremendous reassurance. It's a new element of Medicare. It's the biggest structural addition to Medicare in 20 years, and Mr Latham's going to abolish it.
Would you like to respond, Mr. Latham?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you only need a safety net if you've turned Medicare into a high-wire act and the families are at risk of falling off. I mean, if you've got the availability of bulk billing doctors, you don't need a safety net because people have got the guarantee of getting that service direct from their GP. So a safety net is outside the principles of Medicare. Medicare is not about a second-class safety net, and Mr Howard's got a big problem with his policy because it's inflationary, it's being rorted by some doctors, it's blowing out in its costs. I mean, the very best thing we can do with the public's money is put it into Medicare. Put it into the investments in bulk billing that provide that service to the Australian people. So we don't believe in a safety net, we believe in Medicare. And we believe in the availability of bulk billing doctors, and if you do those things, if you get the system back to where it was, you don't need the safety net. You can actually invest and provide the bulk billing service that matters so much to Australian families, getting those out-of-pocket expenses down and giving them the peace of mind that comes from Medicare.
Malcolm Farr, a question for Mr. Latham.
Mr. Latham, last week you said you offered to lower income tax for lower income earners. But to fund that, you said you would have to increase at least 5 taxes. Now, that's not a particularly good advertisement for someone who says he'll take the harsh burden, tax burden off families. Can you tonight say to us that in government you would not increase taxes and you would not create new taxes? And can you be specific about what taxes that affect families you would eliminate or significantly lower?
Well, you've seen our tax policy, significantly lower income tax. Provide the relief under $52,000 that Mr Howard and Mr Costello said on budget night couldn't be provided. I mean, that's our significant commitment to provide tax relief for all Australian taxpayers. I mean, the hard workers on $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year, they're all forgotten on budget night. Well, Labor's looking after those people by providing tax relief and for families, ensuring that you've got significant benefits in the family payments, $70 to $80 a week for middle Australian families. So that's a very, very significant commitment to take the pressure off those families, to ease the squeeze on middle Australia. In terms of our tax commitments, they're set out in the policy. We haven't taken the easy route in this campaign of just spending the money. We're actually identifying the savings. We're fully funding all of our commitments and ensuring that we keep the budget in surplus. Our commitments on tax are to lower tax as a proportion of GDP, bring down government revenue as a proportion of the economy. That's our commitment to lean, efficient government. And on top of that, no increase in company tax rates, no change to the capital gains tax. And our most significant commitment really is solving the problems that Mr Howard left on budget night, when he left 80% of Australian taxpayers out under $52,000 a year. Our approach is tax relief for the many, not just the few, and provide the incentive and the economic growth and the productivity that can drive our nation forward in a fair and decent way.
Response, Mr. Howard?
Well, Mr Latham's tax policy, so far from being fair on middle Australia, actually increases the burden for several 100,000 Australian families. It's very punitive on stay-at-home mothers. Those mothers who decide when their children are young that it's in the best interest of their children that they be at home full-time. We believe in choice in this area. We don't mandate parental behaviour, but we do believe that where in a family the mother or indeed the father decides to stay home full-time to look after the children, they shouldn't be penalised. And that particular group are very hard hit by Mr Latham's proposals. I mean, what is the justice of putting an additional burden of $500 or $600 on a single income family with 3 children, 1 under 5, where their income is $30,000 or less? What is the fairness in hitting sole parent families? There are many hundreds of thousands of Australian families who are badly disadvantaged by this tax package.
Mr. Latham?
Well, 9 out of 10 families are better off on a weekly basis under our plan. And that's a significant boost, particularly for middle Australia. If people are on $60,000, $70,000 a year, they're going to be $70 to $80 a week better off under our plan than Mr Howard's budget plan. So these are significant gains, and it's also about problem solving. Mr Howard's left this problem of 600,000 Australian families with the family debts averaging $1,000. We're actually going to resolve the family debt crisis. We're also going to provide, for the first time ever in the tax system, 2 tax-free thresholds for the single income family. This is the element of income splitting that Mr Howard's been talking about for 30 years, but I'm actually implementing. I'll be implementing that in government for the benefit of the single income families who are a mile ahead under our plan. How can you talk about income splitting for 30 years, never do it, and then criticise the Labor Party when we provide 2 tax-free thresholds, the first 12,000 no tax for the single income family? This is a good plan. It eases the squeeze on middle Australia, and it's the right thing for the Australian economy.
Malcolm, you have a question for the Prime Minister?
Mr Howard, Treasury told us last Friday that the prospect was that over the next 4 years, budget surpluses would amount to $25 billion. How can you continue to tell Australians that the government can't afford to lower the excise on petrol so that it makes it cheaper for the family to run the car, pay for dental care so that pensioners don't have to go around without proper treatment, decrease the cost of going to university, a whole raft of things that directly affect families, but you have for some particularly considerable period said is too expensive to do?
Well, Malcolm, last Friday was good news for the Australian economy. Of course, what it demonstrated is that the economy is running very strongly, and that is very good news. And sensibly, last Friday, the Treasurer announced that we're going to put some of the surpluses in future away in a special fund for the future. I mean, I hear a lot of people saying to me as I go around the country, yes, we'd like more money spent on services, we'd like more tax relief, but we also want to make sure, particularly with an ageing population, and that is one of the big challenges that this country faces, how we manage the transition to an older population, maintain an appropriate level of services, and also provide all the other things for the working age population. And the Treasurer announced the establishment of a future fund, which is going to, in effect, use some of the surpluses of today to help meet the expenses of tomorrow. Now, I think that is very good national housekeeping, and it's only been made possible because of what I said right at the beginning of this debate, and that is that we've run a strong economy. If you don't run a strong economy, I mean, when the Labor Party was in office, they left us with $96 billion of debt. They ran deficit after deficit after deficit. We've done completely the opposite. It's not a question of what you promise, it's what you do. Mr Latham can promise the earth, but if he doesn't run a strong economy, if we have bad economic management, he can't deliver any of those things. Now, during the course of the campaign, I'll be making a number of announcements. I've already made one, particularly in relation to workers over the age of 55, which would give them a tax break, and we'll be laying out some of our plans, but everything depends upon running a strong economy. If you don't do that, you can't achieve your promises.
Mr Latham, would you like to respond?
Well, Mr Howard's promising a future fund. I'll tell you the best future for Australian families. Provide them with the relief and the improved family payments that lets them look after the household budget right now. Raising children is the most important thing that's happening in this country. And I think those families need the very best system of family payment support, and they need tax relief. I mean, as I've been talking to families, they complain about the high level of tax, the highest tax in government in Australia's history, record levels of household debt, the family debt crisis out of the family payment system, the extra expenses, out-of-pocket expenses with the loss of bulk billing doctors, and all these extra user pays in the education system. Families are screaming out for relief right now. They need the support right now. We've got to ease the squeeze on middle Australia and make sure that tax relief's available under $52,000 a year, 80% of the taxpayers who missed out on budget night. And for goodness sake, clean up the mess of the family payment system. It's like a spaghetti bowl of complexity and debt. We've simplified it in our plan and providing significant relief for Australian families. That's the future fund that I want for Australia.
Mr Howard?
Well, one of the elements of Mr Latham's policy is to take away that $600 that people are receiving right at the moment. And what his explanation is, he says it's not real. Well, I've met plenty of Australian parents who say it's real. See, Mr Latham's party does not trust Australian parents with $600 per child to spend on their children. I actually think it's a very good idea for parents to have a lump sum. Sure, there'll be a small percentage that'll waste it, but why should you penalise the 95% of Australian parents who do the right thing by their children, whose dedication to their children, concern for their children is the highest priority in their life? And getting $600 coming along at the end of the year per child, you can do a lot with that. And that has been my experience, and I think he's out of touch with the needs of modern parents in saying it's not real. It's real, all right, and they know it.
Jim Middleton, your first question to Mr. Howard.
Mr. Howard, musing about your future, I think it was on Perth radio in late June 2000, you said, and I quote, "The Australian people are entitled to my candour on this. What's changed in 4 years? Why were we entitled to your candour 4 years ago? Why are we not entitled to it now? Why should we trust you with a returning to government again when you won't entrust to us your views about your future? Why, when we won't know whether you're going to be around for 3 months, let alone 3 years?"
Jim, as far as I am concerned, I welcome the question. I welcome the question for the very simple reason that I love this job. I hope I do it well. I do my best. If the Australian people are good enough to re-elect me, I'll continue in this job for as long as they want me to, and as long as the Liberal Party wants me to. One of the advantages I have is that I'm proud of my team. I have around me in Peter Costello, John Anderson and Alexander Downer, to name but three people who, along with me, have been part of a highly successful government over the last 8.5 years. And I want to pay particular tribute to those three for the contribution they've made. The economic success that this country has had in the last 8.5 years is overwhelmingly due to the tremendous work of Peter Costello as Treasurer. He's a real asset to the government. There's nobody in the government who understands the bush better than John Anderson. And I think the skillful way in which Alexander Downer has handled the job of Foreign Minister over the last 8.5 years has contributed to the strong standing of this country and the respect that this country has around the world. But I will, if I'm re-elected, I'll pour myself into the job, but I'll continue there as long as the Australian people and my party want me to. Now, that is my position. That is my candid statement to the Australian people. And those who know me, and that is, I hope, a lot of Australians, know that there is nothing I want to do more than go on serving the Australian people in this position.
Mr. Latham, your response?
Well, I'm proud of my team as well. I love them all. But as the leader of the team, I make a full commitment to be there for the long haul and the benefit of the Australian people. You know, from my perspective, I'm 43 years of age. I feel like I'm in the prime of my life. I've got a lot to contribute for the future. And I think of the high office of Prime Minister, I think, geez, what an honour, what an opportunity to do great things for the Australian people and to bring them into your trust, to let them know what you plan to do in the future. And Mr. Howard's been around in politics 30 years. He must know what he plans to do if he wins the next election. 12 months ago, he said he almost gave it away. I think he really should bring the Australian people into his trust and say, look, this is the way it is. If it's 18 months and then he hands over to Peter Costello, well, just say that. I think people will respect him more for just being direct and straight about his own future. And if it is Mr. Costello, the public's got the right to know. I think in a democracy, one of the most important principles is you've got to know who and what you're voting for. And if you haven't got that, what you've got is one big risk, that you might vote for someone, but you end up with a different kettle of fish, someone you didn't want, you didn't vote for, and you weren't told about.
Anything you'd like to add, Mr. Howard?
Yes, I can simply say that if I get re-elected, I know what I want to do, and that is go on serving the Australian people and implement the plans that I'm going to take to them. But I will be re-elected not as a one-man band. I've never been a one-man band. I've always led a team. And I think that team is a real asset. And I know there's a preoccupation with, in the Labor Party with attacking some of them. I don't know why they do so, because the more they attack them, the more they elevate them, because we have together had the honour of leading Australia. And that is the approach that I will bring if I'm re-elected as part of a very powerful team.
Jim, a question for Mr. Latham.
Mr. Latham, the word liar has been thrown around fairly freely during this campaign. For instance, you've called Mr. Howard a liar for changing his mind on his never-ever pledge on the GST. But you changed your mind between late line and lunchtime on the question of the capital gains tax in the family home. Last Tuesday lunchtime, you told us that 9 out of 10 Australians were going to benefit from your family tax package. By dinner time, it was 7 out of 10 Australians. You changed your mind. And why should we entrust you with the government of this country? Aren't you, by your own definition, a liar?
Well, no, Jim, we were up front at the presentation of our tax and family plan about how the statistics added up. 9 out of 10 families better off on a weekly basis. And when you looked at the annual figures, 7 out of 10 better off if you wanted to include Mr Howard's $600 lump sum. But from a Labor perspective, for a long, long time, we've been very critical of that $600 payment. Why? For a lot of families, they never really get to see it because it's eaten up by the family debt crisis. The 600,000 Australians with a debt averaging $1,000. A lot of them won't get to see this payment at all. The other thing is the tricky thing that the government did with the indexation arrangements for family payments. They moved from the wage-based system to the less generous CPI, and that $600 value will reduce to zero in a number of years. And the other problem is, and this is where I think Mr Howard needs to get around the kitchen table and look at how families do their budgets. They need the support and the payments as the bills come in, as the bills for the clothes, the food, the nappies, the sporting and school equipment, they all come in on a fortnightly basis. So we'll make the payments and the resources available on a fortnightly basis to match up against the real life circumstances of Australian families. You know, if there's people in the Liberal Party can go down to Woolies once a year and buy their groceries and use the lump sum, the reality is you've got to pay that money as the bills come in, and we made it quite plain. It's consistent with the way the government presents its figures. On a fortnightly basis, you wouldn't include the 600 lump sum, that's an annual payment, but on the annual figures you would, because it is just that, an annual payment. So we were upfront about that, and I think families can understand in their real life circumstances, especially if they've got the debts, especially if they need the money on a fortnightly basis, especially if they're worried about the indexation swindle, that Labor's got the right approach and many of the answers that they need in their strapped financial circumstances.
It's your turn, Mr Howard.
Well, two things. Firstly, Mr Latham wasn't up front at the beginning. He gave the impression that 9 out of 10 were better off, and then he was forced into qualifications. But let's move on from that. It's never a lie to change your mind, particularly if you submit yourself to the Australian public after you've changed your mind, and that's what I did in relation to the GST. I was up front. I had an election. I said, I'm going to introduce a GST. A bit of bark was taken off me in the process, but the Australian public endorsed it. And can I just say one other thing on the $600? Can I repeat, to say to the parents of Australia that you're not capable of knowing how to spend $600 on the most important people in the world to you, your children, is an insult. And it's an insult to 95% of Australian parents who do the right thing by their kids.
Mr Latham?
Well, it's hardly an insult to say that as the bills come in on a fortnightly basis, that's when Labor will make the financial support available. We've provided very, very significant improvements in the family payment system. Instead of 3 systems, there'll be just one. Instead of so many families being riddled with debts and having the nightmare of arguing with Centrelink about it, we'll all but eliminate those debts through massive improvements in the system, pushing the means test threshold out to 50,000, abolishing FTBB, which has been a great debt generator. We'll do these things that actually solve problems. And as I talk to the families and they're doing their sums and trying to pay their bills, they need solutions. They need the improved financial assistance, our extra $70 to $80 a week for middle Australian families. They need an answer to the family debt crisis. And a lot of them, the single income families, they need the elements of income splitting to reward them for their effort and give them real life choice. I really respect the choice of parents who want to stay at home and look after their children while the other parent goes out to earn money. We've got to foster those choices, and that's one of the big goals of Labor's better family payment system.
Mr Latham, a question on education. Your policy involves scrapping the 25% HEX rise allowed under the government's legislation and abolishing full fee degrees. So where would you get the money to give universities the funds they need? Would the result be cutbacks in university funding? And on schools, there's a high level of anxiety in the independent school sector over what would happen to funding arrangements under Labor. Will you end that uncertainty before the election so parents know when they vote what's going to happen with their school?
Oh, absolutely, Laurie. We'll have the full detail of our school funding plan out in the course of the campaign. But it's based on this very important principle that we'll maintain the overall funding for non-government schools, but we'll have a fairer pattern of funding distribution so that there's more resources for your battling Catholic, independent and Christian schools. Now sure, Geelong Grammar and the King's School, with their massive resources, they're going to receive a reduced federal government contribution, but in the name of fairness, we've got to do that. If you want to get the money to where it's needed, the needy Catholic, independent and Christian schools in the non-government sector, you've got to do that. And the other thing you've got to do is provide extra resources for the battling government schools. I mean, the choice that I want for Australian parents is to know that whether they send their children to a government or non-government school, it's going to be a good school. It's going to be a high achievement school that gives parents one of the best guarantees in life that their children can climb the ladder of opportunity and get ahead through their hard study and their academic achievements. So in school funding, we can do a lot better than Mr Howard's unfair funding system, and that's what Labor aims to achieve. For the universities, we're putting extra resources into the indexation of funding, an extra 20,000 university places, a $150 million regional fund for universities that have missed out, and also $450 million for universities of the 21st century. So overall, we have shown that the university system in Australia will be better off for ending the user pay system, for stopping the 25% increase in HECS, for abolishing the full fee system. I mean, I never thought in this country we'd be talking about $100,000 university degrees. But under Mr Howard, that's what we've got. Labor will end that and put a bit of fairness back into higher education so that those students working hard tonight on their books and their computer can get their best chance in life, go on to a university degree based on their merit, based on their hard work, not on their parents' wallet.
Mr Howard?
Well, it's pretty obvious from that there's a fundamental divide between the Labor Party and the coalition on the issue of school funding. We believe absolutely in the right of parents to decide what is the best schooling for their children. And it's got to be remembered that whenever a parent sends a child to a non-government school, it takes a load off the taxpayer. It costs on average $10,000 a year to educate a child in the government school. And in the case of a school like King's, the maximum amount coming from the federal government is the equivalent of about $2,000. And the growth in independent schools over the last few years has not been in schools like King's or Geelong Grammar. It's been in the low-fee schools in the outer suburbs of Sydney, where the average fee is about $2,000 a year. Mr Latham has a hit list, and it's about time that hit list was published so that the parents of independent school children know exactly where they stand.
Mr Latham?
Well, I know many of those low-fee non-government schools are in my electorate, and we'll be supporting them with extra resources. Now, the King's School that Mr Howard mentions is a very fine school, but the truth is it's rolling in resources. It's got playing fields and buildings and endowments that are way beyond the expectations of 99% of the schools in this country. So surely the fair thing to do is to say, if you're overfunded, let's get the resources to where it's really needed. Let's get it to the battling non-government schools that need that extra funding. And for the government schools, let's give parents one of the most important guarantees in life, that if you send your kid down to the neighbourhood school, it's going to be a good school. It'll have the resources, the teaching expertise, the discipline, the standards, the values, and the pride in excellence and achievement to give those kids a good chance in life. I mean, the reason I'm here tonight is I got those opportunities through two great government schools. But I look at so many of those schools today and I see the need for more funding support, and that's what I'll get under a federal Labor government.
Mr Howard, you once promised that there would be no $100,000 university degrees, and as Mr Latham said, we now find degrees, courses that are going to cost more than that, up to $117,000 in one case at least. How do you justify that? And on schools, what have you got against supporting schools, government and non-government, on the basis of need?
Well, Laurie, the remark I made about the $100,000 was in the context of HECS-funded places. And Mr Latham knows that, and others who look at the context of the remarks will know that. The $100,000 fees are those that are full fee-paying ones. Foreigners can pay to get into Australian universities now, and what we are providing is the same opportunity for about less than 2% of the total number of places in universities for full fee-paying places, supported by a loan scheme. And any suggestion that the average person would have to pay $100,000 is absurd. The average contribution of the student under the HECS scheme will rise under our proposals to about 28%, so that 72% of the HECS-funded place will still be borne by the taxpayer. Now, as far as schools are concerned, my philosophy is one of choice. At the moment, 68% of Australian school children are educated in government schools. I am the product, proudly the product of the New South Wales government education system, and I'm very grateful for the education I received at Earlwood Primary School and Canterbury Boys High School. But I believe, both as a parent and as Prime Minister, as a citizen, that because of the values involved in education and the culture of education, I believe it is fundamental that people should have the right to determine how their children are educated and in what environment. That is why we introduced the new schools policy. If it hadn't have been for us, all these schools, these low fee paying Christian and other schools that Mr Latham speaks of, many of them wouldn't exist, because there's been a huge expansion of them under our new schools policies at very low fees, and the Labor Party was very much opposed to that policy when we brought it down in 1996.
Mr Latham, you get to respond.
Well, there you go. Some people say that Mr Howard and I have got nothing in common. We both come out of the government school system. How about that? And it's a great tribute, isn't it, that the Prime Minister and the alternative Prime Minister are products of public education in this country. Well, all the more reason to back our government school teachers, to back the schools with resources. I remember Mr Howard earlier this year saying that they lacked values and standards. There's a lot of schools that need improvement, but there's a lot of teachers doing the right thing. And I give them this commitment: I'll never be standing on the sidelines as a carping critic of those schools. If there's a problem, I'll be stuck in to fix it. And Mr Howard also made a point about higher education. He said, oh, the overseas students pay the full fees. Well, so they should. They've never paid Australian taxes. But if you're in this country and you've been paying your taxes under the highest taxing government in Australia's history, and your kid's getting good results at school, they're head down, bum up getting the study done, and they want to go on to university, well, surely they should have that opportunity in life with affordability in the higher education system. So I'm not worried about people from overseas paying the full fees. I don't want Australians, the sons and daughters of Australian taxpayers, doing it, and it won't happen under a Labor government.
Mr Howard?
Well, I certainly support teachers. I have no alternative. I married one. But I think the other important thing to say about this whole issue is to get it back to choice. I mean, in the end, it's parents who should decide where their children are educated. And once you violate the principle that every time a parent decides to send their child to a non-government school, they should have some recognition of that through some level of funding, then I think you are a long way down the path towards a situation where eventually you eliminate state aid or government assistance to certain non-government schools. Now, I think that is a wrong principle, because no matter what school it is, I think you're entitled to a certain amount of recognition from the government, and then the level of that recognition should be according to need, and that is exactly what our policy is at the moment, and Mr Latham threatens it.
Gentlemen, the time's come for closing statements. Mr Howard, you get to go first.
Can I say to my fellow Australians that when I became Prime Minister in 1996, I inherited a very big government deficit in the budget. And over the last 8.5 years, it's fair to say, and even our critics acknowledge, that we have managed the Australian economy well. We've seen employment rise by 1.3 million. We've seen interest rates at their lowest level in 30 years, and that means that paying off a home is easier now than it would have been if the old rates had obtained. We've seen business investment climb. We've seen real wages rise by over 13%. And the main reason that they have risen by so much, in other words, the main reason why we've been able to pay ourselves more without creating more unemployment, is that we've run an industrial relations system based on high productivity. Now, that will be threatened if there is a change of government, because the Labor plan is to hand back control of the industrial relations system to the union movement, and we'll go back to a situation where you have inflationary wage rises, and if that happens, the retaliation from the Reserve Bank will be a lift in interest rates. We've heard a lot from Mr Latham tonight about promises. You can't deliver promises unless you run a strong economy. You can't deliver promises unless you keep the budget in surplus. When Labor was last in government, the budget was deep in deficit. We've had a remarkable record over the last 8.5 years. We've paid off something like $96 billion of government debt, and that's given us $5.5 billion a year to spend on health and education and family benefits and taxation relief. The other issue to consider, of course, is that of defence and national security. Everything about the future depends on us maintaining a strong stand against terrorism and giving this country strong defences. Unless we have a strong economy and we're strong on national security, nothing else can be achieved. And those two things are fundamental to the future of our nation.
Mr. Latham, your statement to close the debate.
Well, there's no doubt about Mr. Howard. He's got the scare campaigns. I think we've actually got to talk about the future in a positive way. I'm optimistic about what we can achieve for Australia's future, and I'm proud of the fact that in this campaign we're offering the Australian people clear choices. There's Labor's plan for national security, which is about getting it right in our part of the world, versus Mr. Howard's strategy, which has been more about the other side of the world and security in the region. There's Labor's plan for tax and family, which is about relief. 100% of taxpayers getting relief, families receiving significant financial benefits, easing the squeeze on middle Australia, versus Mr. Howard's plan, which is tax relief for just 20%, the few rather than the many in the Australian economy. And on health policy, we're dead set committed to restoring bulk billing to 80% as one of the foundation stones of Medicare. We don't believe in a two-tier system. We don't believe in a second-class safety net. And on education, it's been a good debate, and I think an instructive debate tonight, because the Labor approach is about opportunity. Fair funding for our schools, 20,000 extra TAFE places, 20,000 extra university places, stopping the 25% HECS increase and getting rid of those full fees. So in these areas, Labor's got the commitments that make a difference. It's not user pays, it's about opportunity, it's about affordability, it's about easing the squeeze on middle Australia. These are fully funded commitments. We're going to keep the budget in surplus. We're going to do everything we can to put downward pressure on interest rates. And if I can just mention one issue in closing, it's this question of truth in government. I believe in it, and I think we need a government that always tells the Australian people the truth. I want for the Australian people a government as good as the people themselves. Honest, hard-working, sincere, fair income Australian, and that's why I'm asking for the support of the public on the 9th of October.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I'd also like to thank my colleagues on the panel, who I'm sure join me in wishing both of you the best of luck. And to you, our viewers, thank you for being with us, and good night.
Well, that's a debate. Now for the fun. Who won and who lost? We've invited into our studios a specially selected audience of uncommitted voters, and they've been worming their responses to the two leaders throughout the evening. After the break, the worm returns with the verdict.
Fuller races up inside his Australian teammate Wilson. He looks nice and relaxed and long in stride. Lamar and Benitez just dropping back through the field now. Fuller leads them on the straight by a very considerable margin. He's only about 30 metres away from securing his 4th gold medal. Coming second is Helm, but Fuller's leading the field by 20 metres. Fuller comes up and takes gold. 52-27. Helm of Germany silver. Green of the United States bronze. And that's the thing.
Tomorrow,
Brett Eberts from Port Adelaide.
as we crown a new Magarey medalist, we'll bring you the sport live from local football's Night of Nights. Plus the first crucial training run as the Power begins its biggest week. Tomorrow on National 9 News.
Until Wednesday at Target, if you buy any kids or baby set, you'll get 50% off the second one of equal or lesser value. Excludes underwear and sleepwear.
If you're into craft, come to the fair. The Craft and Quilt Fair comes to Adelaide Thursday, September 16 to Sunday, September 19. Buy craft supplies, everything from paper craft to patchwork. Be inspired by divine displays. Meet knitting guru Prudence Mapstone. See exotic textile art and the South Australian Quilt Show. Get creative in free workshops all day, every day. There's so much craft to see, learn and buy, all under one roof. Only at the Craft and Quilt Fair. Open 10 till 5 daily, September 16 till 19 at the Royal Adelaide Showground.
I want to release an album and a film clip. That is my dream.
I just need some money to get me started.
Shape up for summer, get into Southern Workout Store. Get great savings on all the top gear. Treadmills, the full range. Runners and walkers, the latest models. Some items 20 to 40% off. Exercise bikes, weight machines, home gyms and rowers. Great gear, great prices, great results. Everything you need to shape up and look great from South Australia's largest fitness store. Shape up for summer and get into Southern Workout Store. We don't match prices, we just sell for less.
Trim's range of new season fashion means you'll always find the styles that let you be yourself. Trim.
To celebrate 45 years of television in South Australia, Adelaide's Channel 9 and Australia Post have teamed up to produce a souvenir stamp sheet featuring amazing local images past and present. It's a piece of local history and available from selected Australia Post outlets.
Fuller races up inside his Australian teammate Wilson. He looks nice and relaxed and long in stride. Lamar and Benitez just dropping back through the field now. Fuller leads them on the straight by a very considerable margin. He's only about 30 metres away from securing his 4th gold medal. Coming second is Helm, but Fuller's leading the field by 20 metres. Fuller comes up and takes gold. 52-27. Helm of Germany silver. Green of United States bronze. And that's
Sunday night at the movies. G'day. Paul Hogan stars in the hilarious comedy smash.
You're gay, right?
Most of the time, pretty happy.
Crocodile Dundee in Los Angeles, 8:30 tonight on 9.
Next, in an all-new changing rooms, there's elation and celebration. No! But will it all end in tears? All new changing rooms is next.
Throughout tonight's debate, 90 uncommitted voters selected by the McNair Ingenuity Research Group have been worming their responses for the two leaders. Each vote has been given a handset. Pressing the top button indicates a positive response and pressing the lower button indicates a negative. The more the buttons are pressed, the greater the like or dislike of what's being said. In a moment, the verdict on who won and who lost and your chance to vote. But joining me now is Annabelle Crabb, who's covering the campaign for the Age newspaper. Annabelle, these things are always frightening for all the contestants. How do you think they coped?
Well, they coped all right tonight. You're right, it is pretty frightening. They do spend a lot of time in preparing, and they spend a lot of time bickering about various points to do with the debates.
And in the studio, you could feel the tension.
Yeah, well, they certainly put the weekend aside to prepare, and they're right to, because it is a big deal. It's a big thing for either leader to be seen to win on the night, not just for their own sort of psychological benefit, but also for the benefit of their supporters. You know, you find that people are much more excited about going out and putting up posters and campaigning if they think that their candidates come out all right on the night.
Debates can be turning points.
They can, yeah. And, I mean, the last campaign, for example, was a turning point for Kim Beazley. He did very well after winning the debate, clearly. Although that, of course, is an example that we need to take on board in remembering that debates can't always be decisive either, because, of course,
what we see here with our wormers, in fact, is a snapshot of how these people feel tonight, how uncommitted Australia would be.
On the night, yeah. And it's also an assessment of the two men face-to-face and how they go against each other.
And if that's the case, then I would think that, that once we look at the worm, which mercifully the leaders couldn't see while they were speaking, or Howard couldn't see, that for Howard on terror, I mean, the result is terrifying, isn't it?
The worm was very interesting tonight on terror. The worm, I think the pacifist, we've established that over the last hour. I mean, this is
so
for me was the...
Let's come back, but let's take a look.
Our capacity to deal with terrorism in our region has in no way been impaired by what we have done in Iraq, or indeed has it been impaired by what we did in Afghanistan. And can I remind all of you that Afghanistan will be having free elections on the same day as we are, on the 9th of October. And women will be having the vote at that election, I think, for the first time for many, many years, if at all. And it is a reminder that despite all the negative comment, you can make real progress in the war against terrorism.
And just for comparison, before we talk about it, let's take a look at Latham on the same subject.
And that's why, one of the reasons why we didn't support the Iraq conflict in the first place. We've made a strategic decision which we believe is in Australia's national interest. That'll never be influenced by these evil, barbaric terrorists, never. We'll always do the things that are right for Australia. defending and securing this country as best we can.
Annabelle, to a political journalist, this was a surprise.
It was a surprise. I mean, Saddam Hussein was found in a wormhole and our worm just dug one as the Prime Minister started talking about terrorism. It was something that surprised me absolutely. I really expected national security to be a strong suit of John Howard's going into this debate. The only explanation that I can think of is that when they were talking about national security, it was always in the context of Iraq. And what the worm showed us tonight, I think, very, very firmly was that our audience members weren't that comfortable with any discussion of Iraq. They didn't approve. And when John Howard talked about the reasons why he had to go into Iraq and the fact that he didn't regret it, the worm went down. And Mark Latham took quite an aggressive line on Iraq, and the audience seemed to approve. So that was the outcome, and I found it surprising because I did, as I say, expect national security to be a plus. Just before we leave, though, do you think this means that the embassy bombing is no tamper politically? Well, as I said, I think that the terror and national security debate here was framed largely around Iraq. I should point out that there was a climb for John Howard when he talked about the embassy bombing and terror in the region and the importance of not giving in to terrorists. So, but at that point, it was a climb out of a decline. So the worm remained subterranean for John Howard during the entire sort of national security part of the debate, and it remained above ground for Mark Latham for most of that time, which, as I said, I found pretty surprising. Yeah, not what the Libs planners would have expected or anticipated. Well, I think that, you know, most of the polling demonstrates that people, you know, back the government on national security and on the economy as well. I think that the government expected, with good reason, they are two very strong campaign points for them. So it's not borne out by the worm this evening. Sure. Let's move on to Medicare, where Mark Latham did very well. There's one thing about Medicare: if you haven't got the availability of bulk billing, you haven't really got the guts of Medicare. And Labor will never give up, never surrender, never give up on getting the bulk billing rate back up to 80% where it belongs. It takes a pressure point off the public hospital system, and it is one of the foundation stones of universal health care for all Australians, that you can find a bulk billing doctor, whether it's for your children or your parents, and you can lower those out-of-pocket expenses that are putting so much pressure on Australian families. Well, that wasn't really a surprise, was it? Not a surprise at all, no. And you'll find later in the debate he gets pretty much the same response when he starts talking about schools. And health and education are absolutely areas where Labor traditionally polls much better than the government. So that wasn't a surprise at all. John Howard as well, actually, I should mention, got a bit of a spike in the beginning of his opening statement when he talked about Medicare. But after that, his reply to Mr. Latham's comments about Medicare put him back below the line again. The funny thing about this debate was that actually Mr. Howard spent a lot of time below the line and Mr. Latham spent a lot of time above it. In fact, overwhelmingly that was the case. Not something that I expected necessarily to be the case all the time. And it was pretty consistent as well. There weren't a lot of wild fluctuations. You know, the worm was, you know, behaving relatively moderately, but definitely in a different place for each of the leaders. Yeah, although Latham did so well, if you hadn't been watching the worm, as most viewers weren't, you wouldn't have known that the debate was anything else but pretty even. Well, I thought they both performed pretty creditably. They both looked comfortable. I mean, remember, John Howard's done 5 of these debates. He did 2 in '96 and 1 in each election since. This is Mark Latham's first, so you'd expect him to be a bit more nervous, but he looked very relaxed. The other thing that I'd point out is, I suppose, that debates are often good for opposition leaders because they have new ideas, and certainly people here were interested, according to the worm, in what Mark Latham had to say tonight. Whatever the surprise, it's these people behind us who make these decisions in democracy. Correct, we should. It's this handful of votes that swings elections. They were absolutely cruel, it seemed to me, when the Prime Minister was talking about how much he loved the job.
So I will, if I'm re-elected, I'll pour myself into the job, but I'll continue there as long as the Australian people and my party want me to. Now, that is my position. That is my candid statement to the Australian people, and those who know me, and that is, I hope, a lot of Australians, know that there is nothing I want to do more than go on serving the Australian people in this position.
Annabelle, tell me that that is not theatre of cruelty.
Well, I think you could...
He's singing his heart out there and they're going...
Yes, those worm's thumbs have come out again. Well, I think you could politely describe that as a large round of indifference from the worm. I mean, and I return to my earlier point about, you know, the voters in this room are very familiar with Mr. Howard, so perhaps the prospect of more of the same is not terribly exciting. Certainly didn't seem to galvanise the worm in an upwardly direction. The interesting thing about the leadership question is that Mark Latham was quite hairy-chested on this point. He really got into the Prime Minister quite repeatedly about this sort of idea of cutting and running, and that seemed to generate a reasonably positive response for him too.
Yeah. OK, well, the final arbitration, of course, is the worm's verdict. Who won and who lost the debate? And according to our 90 uncommitted voters, Annabelle, do you want to do the honours?
Well, it seems to have gone to Mr. Latham by a margin of 67% to 33%, which, spookily, is the same margin as this room recorded at the last election.
They're a bolshy lot, aren't they?
Well, I guess this could be, I mean, it's obviously a good sign for Mark Latham. He's had a pretty good win tonight in the eyes of the 90 people behind us. But you could also point out that Kim Beazley had exactly the same result last time, and it didn't seem to help him out at the end of the day, did it?
4 long weeks to go.
4 very long weeks to go, yeah. And
which you'll be on the campaign trail.
I will be. And
Annabelle, thank you very much, and while you're there, may the worm be with you.
And also with you, Charles.
And to our wormers, thank you also. And now, our exclusive 60 Minutes phone poll. If you thought John Howard was a winner, you can vote for him by ringing 1902 553 149. Or if you thought Mark Latham won, you can vote for him by ringing 1902 553 159. You can also SMS us your choice by sending a text message saying either Howard or Latham. It's that simple. 188 9923. The phone lines are open now and will shut at midday tomorrow. And the verdict, your verdict, will be on a current affair tomorrow evening. And that's our program for tonight. We'll be back with another edition of 60 Minutes next week. I'm Charles Woolley. See you then.